Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Malva Kajali, Special Projects Associate here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming scientist and author of the new book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest, Suzanne Simard, in conversation with publisher Victoria Wilson. While we traditionally close our events with poetry, today we are so delighted to close instead with a reading from the book from our very own Suzanne Simard. And the book is out from Knopf in just May of this year, a little bit earlier. So we're so excited to have you. A few quick notes before we get started. Firstly, we've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. First, that here in New York, we're on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. Part and parcel of this acknowledgement is the continued recognition that Black lives matter. Secondly, over the past 21 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, alongside thoughtful social and political meditations from viewers and participants just like you. As a small nonprofit, we really do need your support. So this December, we're fundraising $150,000 in 31 days. Your contributions will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and general operations at the Rail for the year to come. Please check out the chat for more info and links. I'll drop that shortly. But now it's my honor to introduce our guests of this lunchtime. Author and scientist Suzanne Simard is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia and author of the book Finding the Mother Tree. She is known widely for her work on how trees interact and communicate using below ground fungal networks, which has led to the recognition that forests have hub trees or mother trees. I'll let Suzanne and Victoria speak more on this in a moment, but she's joined today by the very special Victoria Wilson, Vice President and Executive Editor at Alfred Knopf. Among the many authors she has published are Walter Abish, Alice Adams, Diane Ravitch, Laurel Ulrich, Susan Cheever, and more that just went through C. Wilson is the author of Volume 1 of A Life of Barbara Stanwyck, which came out in 2013, and currently she's at work on the concluding volume of that same series. She grew up on Martha's Vineyard and lives in New York City and upstate. So delighted to have you. Victoria and Suzanne, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hello out there and welcome everybody. And thank you for being here. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Brooklyn Rail and Malva Kajali and Nick Bennett and the Magical Thong Buoy for this event. And the man with the golden eye and all things American primitive, Frank Maresca of the Rico Maresca Gallery, who was the conduit to Fong. And welcome to you all. So pleased that you could be here with us this afternoon for this truly extraordinary book and to hear from the extraordinary woman who wrote it and lived it, Suzanne Simard. I have to say that Finding the Mother Tree is one of those rare books that changes the way we look at trees, forests, at life itself. Suzanne is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, faculty of forestry, and she forever changed how people view trees and their connections to one another and other living things in the forest. This book is a moving, deeply personal journey of discovery, which she will tell us about once I stop talking and ask her a question. But I just want to say a few things about Suzanne. You know, Suzanne, this is your life, but Suzanne is a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. She's been compared to Rachel Carson and hailed as a scientist who conveys complex technical ideas in a way that is dazzling and profound, which is what this book is. Her work has influenced filmmakers, The Tree of Souls of James Cameron's Avatar, storytellers, Richard Powers, The Overstory. Her TED Talks have been viewed by many more, I'm sure now, than 10 million people worldwide. And in this book, Suzanne brings us into the intimate world of trees, in which she brilliantly illuminates the fascinating and vital truths which we are going to discover. Suzanne's, I just want to say a few more things and then we'll get to the questions. Suzanne's research has been written about in the New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Canadian Geographic, in editorials including CNN, BBC, the Daily Mail, the Times, etc. She's been mentioned on Ted Lasso, seen by I don't know how many hundreds of millions of people. And what started as a legacy, then a place of childhood home, solace, and adventure, grew into a full understanding of the intelligence of the forest. And in Finding the Mother Tree, you take us on the path of your inquiry and discovery. And I have to say, when I read this proposal for Suzanne's book, there was something so special about it from its first sentences. The voice had feeling and power and a wisdom that felt deep and profound and was immediately apparent. And this is one of those books that will change the way you see the world. Also, I might add that the book has been a New York Times bestseller. It's been on the independent bookseller list for months, and it's been reprinted 9 times and counting. And there are now more than 100,000 copies in print, which is fabulous for a book, but it's also fabulous for the world, because the world needs to read this book and to understand what we need to understand about trees and forests. So Suzanne, after all of that, when we were talking on the phone a while ago, and you were talking about, which was sort of alarming, when there were all of those fires that were going up the coast of California, and you mentioned that you could see 5 fires from your town in Nelson, British Columbia. This was when there were fires along the west coast of Oregon and Washington. And do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that happened and is happening?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Victoria, for that lovely introduction. And I wanted to say too that working with Victoria has been one of the best things in my life. She's an incredible editor, and also, you know, accepted me in my writing like full on, which gave me great license and latitude to explore. So I just want to thank Victoria for being so brilliant in her craft. And Malvika, thank you for having us in Fong, and Nick, it's really great to be here for hosting us. And thank you everybody for being part of this conversation. So yes, the fires are incredible, and it's not just the fires, but the floods, the windstorms, the hurricanes, the insect infestations, the stress that our forests are under during this period of climate change. It's truly a, you know, we're at this critical point in the history of the world, and it, you know, out of this kind of disaster, you know, it feels like a disaster. They keep coming, but out of this comes incredible opportunity, and that's what scientists who study systems level phenomena, and that is what a forest is. It's a system. When we study systems level phenomena, we realize that there are critical points of change, leverage points. And Donna Meadows, who wrote a book on complex systems, talks about these leverage points of identifying those points in history, those important things you can do to change the course or the trajectory of where we're going. And we really, truly are at that point right now. With respect to the fires specifically, in the West, we've had, you know, this last summer was a scary summer. We had a heat dome that sat over California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, the Yukon, and partly across Canada, that just, you know, was so hot and dry. I've never experienced anything like it. In my home province of British Columbia, we had 300 fires that started up right as that heat dome was sitting over top of us. 5 right around my little town. Yeah, and they were telling us, don't breathe. Well, no, that's don't breathe. That's like breathing in 60 cigarettes a day. And of course you have
Suzanne,
to breathe.
was this the first time this had happened?
It's not the first time. Unfortunately, we've been getting more and more fires over the last half a decade. So we're definitely in a shift in the fire regime, more frequent, more severe, and we need to pay attention.
So tell us really about the mother trees. You describe them as majestic hubs at the center of forest communication, protection, and sentience. So tell us what they are, what they do, what they carry on.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm a mother tree. So is Victoria. So mother trees and forests are the oldest, largest elders in forests. The reason they're important is, from a tree point of view, is they have huge crowns. That means they have incredible energy because they're photosynthesizing in massive amounts. And a lot of that energy ends up, between 20 and 80%, depending on the ecosystem you're in, into the soil. And that drives, the soil food web, and it drives the major biogeochemical cycles. And a lot of that energy also transmits through this mycorrhizal network, which are these fungi that I study, that I and many people study, that are sort of like the link between trees and plants and soils. They, associate with all of our trees all over the world, where they take that energy and build their bodies through the soil, their mycelium, and then they pick up nutrients and water, bring them back to the trees. And because these big old trees have huge crowns and huge root systems, they're the most highly connected, because these mycelium can connect other trees. And so they are the hubs of the forest. They're the matriarchs of the forest, and not just their size, it's what they do. They have a role. And the role in what I study is in the regenerative capacity of the forest. So seedlings growing up and linking into that network have a much higher chance of survival. They grow better, they're more resilient, they have got more defense, and they become the next matriarchs of the forest themselves. So it is part of this really important intergenerational cycle.
And, it's interesting because we've been taught that instead of these trees, living organisms competing with one another, your research shows that these trees cooperate and engage in interdependent relationships. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, I grew up in forests and saw the forest as a connected place. But when I went through forestry school, we were taught about disconnection. And that disconnection meant that these trees are individuals that are just, there for themselves, to get as many resources as they can, be competitors, be dominant, dominate the ecosystem, and then you'll be a good, healthy tree. And that was how forestry was shaped, and agricultural, I would say, and fisheries. And it's not just a forestry issue, it's that competition became sort of like the ecological mantra of how systems were constructed. That, it's all about how they compete with each other and gain as much for yourself as possible. And this isn't how I grew up seeing forests. I grew up in old growth forests. My dad and grandfather and great grandfather were all horse loggers. They had, a light touch on the landscape, and I saw the place as a collaborative place. And so that led me to start to understand, what was forestry? I felt we were on the wrong track. I could see the consequences of that in forest ecosystems. Plantations were like deserts. They were sickly. And today, now we understand that they actually are propagators of fire because they're really flammable. The diversity is so low. And so I started looking at these connections and figured out that actually the forest is there's competition, but collaboration is more important. That this is how the communities are structured, that this is the process by which we have a regenerative forest, is through networks that spawn new seedlings that become the matriarchs of the future.
Well, I was going to ask you, you mentioned that, your father and your grandfather were loggers. And I was going to ask you, you come from a family of loggers, and I was going to ask you, what the forest taught you as a girl that you were aware of then.
I just grew up around trees, and they were my friends. I was quite shy and introverted. So it was what did they teach me? They taught me about friendship, about a place that was secure and that gave me a healthy life, it was a place to explore. It's a place of acceptance. it's a place where, you know, anything seems possible, at least to me as a kid. As a girl, you know, I wasn't really, I wasn't aware, but I was, you know, I wasn't destined to be a logger. I think nowadays a girl could be a logger, but back when I was growing up in the 1960s, that wasn't part of the equation. And so I still wanted to be a person of the forest and to study and be a caretaker of forests. So yeah, all the little events of my life of growing up, you know, in the old forest, you know, going on treasure hunts with my brother and sister, and you know, digging caves in the forest to, you know, to have dirt lump fights. All of that stuff really mattered. It mattered in my connection to the place. And of course, my grandparent, we all spent all of our time in these forests. You know, our family was, you know, had picnics, we had you know, canoe trips, we went camping, we were just people of the forest. So mental to my outlook, and then what I did consequently as a scientist and a researcher.
Well, when you went to school, a forestry school, and you saw what they were teaching, what was your response to that? Talk a bit about that, because that should, I mean, that must, given everything that you came out of, that must have been sort of the antithesis of what you had in your, you know, in your heart and soul, basically, by this point.
You know, it took me a long time to realize that. It was when I was in forestry school, I was so grateful to be there. I was like one of 10 girls in a class of 100 students, and the guys back then were really like, they came from forestry families, and so they were real logger types. And so it was really, I was like a round peg in a square hole. All of the girls were. So we were grateful to be there. We had to struggle for, you know, our to be respected, because there was a lot of sexism. And so I think that at the time I was more engaged in that than the content, but certainly some of the content of the courses I would go, really? Really? That's how it works? But at the time I would just sort of laugh and not really think about it. But then when I started working, so as students, we always worked in the summers in the forest industry. And so I got jobs working for companies. And I think that's when I really started to go, you know, and seeing it on the ground and seeing, you know, how the theories and the research that was done in the universities was being applied on the ground and what we were creating out of this. That's when I really went, this can't be right. And so what that meant back then was, you know, clear cut all the old trees. And this is still the practice today, by the way. So this hasn't changed in 40 years. Clear cut the old trees, spray herbicides, plant seedlings, maybe 1 or 2 species, spray again, maybe cut out the broadleaf trees, maybe go back and space them. And then in 50 years, or 100 years, go and cut it again, not allowing those trees to grow to the great ages that they're naturally have evolved to do. For example, you know, cedar trees in the West, they live to 2,000 or more years, but we're managing them now on 50-year rotations. And so this is a dramatic
Wait a minute,
shift.
let's just stop. I mean, 2,000 years, and it's cut at 50 years. I mean, what is, okay, so what does a tree develop from 1 to 50 and then from 50 to 2,000? I mean, let's talk about that. That is just unbelievable.
It is profoundly important, Victoria, that you've hit on a really important thing. So as a tree ages, it goes through so many changes, right? You know, a 50-year-old tree is really a teenager in a tree's life. And so we're, you know, we're cutting them as teenagers. So just think of your own life and all the things, the wisdom that you've accumulated since a teen, you've developed a lot, and it's the same in trees. So let's just think about climate, for example. Imagine that you're a 2,000-year-old tree. Well, you've lived through many, many climatic fluctuations over that time, and encoded in your genes is your ability to survive those climatic fluctuations. You have a great diversity of base pairs that makes up your genetic code. And that diversity gives you resilience. So case, a drought comes along. Well, you've seen that drought before, you've got the genes to survive it. Or, a frost comes along, you've been through a frost before, you can survive that. So the genetic diversity is important for seeds for the future. So that's one thing. The other thing is that as trees age, they really are microbiomes. Like, they're a consortium of species. A tree is not just a tree. It's full of endophytes and bacteria and fungi, and even the mycorrhizal fungi, for example. That community of mycorrhizal species associated with an old tree is vastly different than that of a 50-year-old tree. There are old growth fungi that only grow on old trees, and they do important things like accessing old carbon pools with nutrients in them. They're part of that cycle of those old ancient pools that are in the soil. As they age too, they host lichens and mosses in their crowns, and lichens, by the way, absorb water during the winter, and then they release that water into their canopies during the summer when it dries out, and that keeps the forest moist. So those old lichens, they really don't start occurring on trees until they're well past that 50-year mark. So by only growing trees to 50 years, we miss out on all of that biodiversity that's associated with age. The other thing that happens, and I'll mention this one other thing, as you age, as a tree ages, it starts to build up its artillery of defense. So it becomes, it puts more and more energy into creating defense enzymes and monoterpenes that defend it against infections and diseases. Those monoterpenes, those defense enzymes, become important in the forest community, because when you get an invasion, for example, of insects or pathogens, those old trees are able to defend themselves. But not only that, through their mycorrhizal networks, they send messages to the younger seedlings around them, which then upregulate their own defense machinery, their own RNA, change their genetic structure so that they're more resistant. And then they also pass that change on to the next generations. And so having these old trees, if you didn't have the old trees around, they wouldn't be able to send these messages out. So going to short rotations is really kind of a bad idea in many ways. And honestly, I could spend another half an hour talking about the importance of aging in forests, but I'll stop there. But
well, we will come back to the old growth forest, but I think it's important I think it would be good for you to talk about how you came to discover the mycorrhizal fungi and what that, because you are the person who discovered this. It said so on Ted Lasso. Actually, I've never seen the show, so I don't. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you came to discover that? Because that's the key to everything.
Well, so I discovered Ted Lasso. I know you didn't ask me about how I discovered Ted Lasso, but Ted Lasso mentioned my name, and my son-in-law phoned me right away and said, "Hey, Ted Lasso, you're famous now." And I'm like, "Who the hell is Ted Lasso?" I didn't know who Ted Lasso was. Anyway, that was a discovery, but you're talking about this other discovery. So yeah, when I was a young scientist in my 20s, and I got a job with the government at the time, who tasked me with trying to grow these plantations of trees following clear cutting. And it didn't take me long to understand that what we were doing was not following natural patterns, right? Natural selection occurs for a reason, or sorry, natural succession. It occurs for a reason. So when you have a disturbance to a forest, like a fire, certain organisms start to come in, like certain fungi, bacteria, plants, and they're healing the land, right? Their job is, it's like a Band-Aid, right? They start to heal the soil. And then another group of plants will start to filter in, and they do another job, and so on. And it's a succession through time of these plants and creatures. And in forestry, what I could see we were doing is we're trying to short circuit succession. Like, let's get past that first stage, get rid of all these plants we don't want, and let's just plant our trees, because that's going to make us money in the future. And so we were trying to, like, the practice, and it still is today, is to take those fireweeds and birches and huckleberries and get rid of them, so we can just grow these trees. And that's when I started seeing that these infections and infestations in the trees, they're not healthy. And so I learned about, mycorrhizas. I didn't discover mycorrhizas. That was a discovery made long before me. Aboriginal people knew about them for a long, long time in North American cultures. In European culture, mushrooms have been a long fascination, and people, there was a guy named Franck who discovered or made published a paper in 1880 saying, hey, these mushrooms actually help trees grow. They're not just saprotrophs or pathogens. There's actually groups of them that are mycorrhizal. And so what I did is I figured out that these mycorrhizas connect trees in real forests, and that they do all of these jobs, that these connections are like, it's like an internet, that information and resources are meted out through this forest, following all kinds of what we call source sink gradients, or how when I say that, it's how stuff flows through forests. They flow from hubs of information or resources to places of need. And when you're walking in the forest, for example, you can feel or you see the light is changing constantly, right? It changes over the course of the day. It changes, as you walk deeper into the forest, it changes all the time. Trees are completely attuned to those changes. Their photosynthetic rates change on the instant. As soon as the light changes, they change. And so all of these flows change in concert with that. So now think like this internet, this below ground internet, is completely poised for change constantly. The shifting of resources goes on moment to moment, day to day, month to month, year to year, always changing. And out of that spawns this regenerative capacity of the forest. So that's what I learned. That's what I discovered. And I think that really has changed how we view the forest, from simply a place of competition to a place of much more sophistication and sophisticated relationships of sharing and collaboration, and competition, yes, as well. But it's just highly, highly complex and sophisticated, and it's wired, it's evolved to recover and regenerate.
But it's a society. It's a society. It's a social entity.
Yeah,
exactly. Is what you're saying. But as I don't know whether you were the only woman, but as one of the only women among your colleagues, when you came in with this, that you had proved this, what was the response, that your colleagues had to this?
Yeah. Shocking, predictable. So, but then it evolved as well. So at first it was just really, ho-hum. So she made this discovery. We don't really care. It doesn't bother. It doesn't impact our lives. From the forestry point of view. So it mostly for the first 10 years, it was ignored. In the academic side, when I published my work, I got a lot of pushback because it was really challenging, how we saw natural selection working, or at least how it was interpreted to work. So since Darwin, did his incredible work on speciation and natural selection, the idea that competition drove those processes really took hold, even though Darwin himself recognized that it was the whole suite of relationships among creatures that caused speciation to happen. But we, in ecology and the translation of ecology and evolution into industrial forestry, that there was a loss in translation there. And so that when I got my papers reviewed, I think that the scientists thought, oh, she's really trying to tear down these tenets of natural selection. And I wasn't at all. I was trying to add to the picture, but that was part of the issue. And so I spent, I have to say, I almost dropped out of studying this because it was just it was really, really tough. But then eventually I went on and got an academic position and kept kept asking questions. I think I spent 20 years of my life fighting the backlash, and then eventually doing a seminal study showing what these networks looked like in forests. And then we were able to sort of move forward when people said, oh yeah, okay, maybe they really do exist. And now we can actually see what they do. So yeah, it's kind
What
of
was
been
it
an
that kept you
interesting.
going through those 20 years? I mean, because really, in a lot of ways, this book is about, I mean, your work is not about instinct. The heart of what's leading the work is trusting that instinct. And it is a book about, in a way, about scientific inquiry, but also, I mean, how science works, but how instinct is crucial to everything.
Yeah, I think this is a really important message, is that science comes from us, right? Science is about us making sense of our world. And that the questions that I ask and many scientists ask are really heartful questions. We draw from our experiences as formative human beings. You know, someone who goes into cancer research, a lot of times they've had somebody in their life important that has passed away from cancer, you know, or someone who's in psychiatry, they've grown up in like, you know, a family with difficulties in that way. And I, you know, grew up as a child of the forest, and so I knew I had this really strong instinct. It was what I knew. And so I've never, you know, of course I question as I go along and do science and go, is this real or is this not? Let's see, let's try it again, let's try it. So all of that scientific method of verifying also just confirm, you know, it helped confirm what I already knew, but it also changed how I saw things. I grew out of that as well. But, you know, I never lost the perseverance to truly understand the forest and try to make change, because what I saw, and I think many people see, is that what we do, like creating plantations, for example, does not emulate what nature is doing. And so I always had that, at least I had that evidence behind me. I had my experience. I had all the science that would verify what I was seeing or lead me in a different path. But all of that helped me grow and keep asking questions. And I'm still doing it. You know, I'm still fascinated, and, you know, and have so many students who are also learning and feel this strong link to the forest. And thank goodness, I mean, we really need people like that.
You know, Suzanne, I was just trying to imagine. I mean, what would the world be? I mean, it's true, we might not have wood structures and wood in the way we use it, but what would the world be like now if all of the trees were like 2,000 years old?
I think about this a lot, right? Like, what would it be like, you know, if landing on the shores or being an Aboriginal person in North America among these wild ancient trees? And it must have been incredible. But actually, I've actually lived through what that's like, because where I grew up in British Columbia, I grew up in a province of old growth forests, right? Where the trees were 2,000 years old, you know, out my back door. And now I live in a province of clear cuts. And so I've seen this change, and it's heartbreaking. It's, you know, I know our people in the West were full of grief over, you know, the loss of our forests to industrial activity, to fires, now to floods. So yeah, I mean, and I think that having these old forests, we need them. So, you know, it's our job to use our hands and use our hearts to restore these forests to the ancient beauties that they once were. And because trees have that genetic capacity to live long lives, you know, all we really need to do is help get them going and stand back and let them live their lives. And, you know, I guess, you know, the old argument of the status quo of chopping down forests, you know, as we've moved across and immigrated across North America, that, oh, you know, we can't lose these jobs. Well, actually, if we treated our forests properly, we'd have way more jobs. We'd have way more wealth. And I don't mean wealth in terms of money, I mean wealthy lives. And so, yeah, you know, I would say we should have that as part of our plan, to let our forests and trees grow to great ages as they naturally have evolved to do.
Well, you know, I was looking into this to see what the big lumber companies were, like the biggest lumber companies, which is like Weyerhaeuser. Is that one of them?
Yeah.
I mean, have people been in touch with, you know, these huge lumber companies?
Yes.
And,
you mean about?
I mean,
Yeah.
well, I mean, like the big ones are something, I don't know if this is correct, but something called West Fraser Timber, Weyerhaeuser, and in Canada, is it Resolute Forest Products? I mean, have, you know, the people, let's say, who were fighting in British Columbia, I mean, do they try to involve these lumber companies? And how could the lumber companies just ignore all of this, what's going on in the world?
It is
I mean,
quite astounding, isn't it? Yeah. So in British Columbia, we have 5 major licensees. We call them licensees companies. West Fraser is one of them. And basically what, you know, because 95% of land in Canada is publicly owned land, which is quite a contrast from the US, where about half is publicly owned. We have basically given away licenses to these major companies, big international corporations, to cut down the forest. And the laws have changed over time, but we allocate a cut. And it used to be, even 20 years ago, that in order to get a license like that, you had to have a mill in the local area and mill that wood. And then that provided jobs for the community and made products, and, you know, people made livings from it. And then slowly no, I shouldn't say slowly, quickly, those corporations were able to convince governments to, hey, we don't need to mill them. We're going to globalize where we're going to mill wood. And so now today, for example, old growth cedar logs that are logged out of BC forests are actually shipped to New Zealand, where they're milled into fine products and then sold to American markets at really high prices because of globalization. And it makes zero sense from a people point of view. And by the way, a lot of these companies, they're striving to get people out of the equation so they can make more money in the name of efficiency. You know, and what are we thinking that this, like, who are these forests for, right? And also ginning up the demand for wood products when we have other products that can substitute or, you know, be used or reduce consumption or just mill properly, or more, you know, there's so many things we could do to reduce the cut rate without even, you know, creating hardship in our world. But, you know, how did this happen? You know, I think that you could look across many product lines, many products that we make where this kind of thing has happened, and it's definitely happened in forestry. And it's kind of a tragedy, because once you get the big corps in there, you know, the local forestry practices, which is what really forests are about, is what, knowing the land, knowing the place, knowing the plant that grows there, or the tree, or, you know, that creek, all that goes away when you have corporate management of big landscapes. So we need to get that back. We need to wrest away the land from those big corporations, give the, you know, the forest back to the people, so the people can look after the forest. And it is really our responsibility to look after the forest.
Well, you know, I was looking this up, and it's from 1850 to 1900, when timber production was very high. Production went from 5 billion board feet to 35 billion. And by 1907, nearly a third of the original expanse of forest, more than 260 million acres, was gone. I mean, and now, I mean, forests cover 80% of the Northeast, but less than 1% of it is old growth forest.
Yeah. That's right. In British Columbia, we have less than 3% of our iconic old growth forests left, and that's probably more than in California and Oregon. And
you know, people are not, because I never thought about old growth forests. I mean, it seems to me that is one of the things that this book has to do, and that there has to be a concerted campaign to make people aware of old growth forest and what it is and its importance. And you know, it's unbelievable, really. I mean, yes, of course, you've seen redwood trees and you know how old they are, but to understand, I mean, talk a little bit about, you know, old growth trees that can discern which seedlings, for instance, are their own kin. I mean, that's fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we recently discovered. And it was from understanding how these mycorrhizal networks facilitate the regeneration of trees. And it seemed like it was like the next logical question was, well, can these trees actually help their offspring more so than another species or a stranger from a different parent? That's called kin recognition, which we've explored extensively in animals, but never in plants. But it turns out through our experiments over the last 3 or 4 years, we figured out that, yeah, these old trees can tell which ones are their own offspring, and they provide them with resources to help them survive. So this idea of kin recognition now we know happens in forests and trees. And I think that really, it's important from how we regenerate forests, because, in industrial reforestation, you don't use local seed. You use seed from a climatic envelope that is quite large. It can be like, a couple 100 kilometers long and cross several 100 meters in elevation. And so then you combine all these seeds from these different sources and then create, seedlings in nurseries and then plant them out. So they're not from their local area. But that turns out it's extremely important especially under stressful conditions, that those parents are really there for their kin, right? They are providing those extra resources, and especially when they're under stress. So if, we found that kin recognition is more important in droughty conditions, or where there's unusually low rainfall, where those parent trees really do send them a lot more water and nutrients, and they survive like 4 times better. And we're seeing this over and over again in our mother tree project, where we're, testing this across big, long climatic gradients. Our experiment is as big as Denmark. And we're finding that these mother trees actually increase survival of kin and other seedlings by about 30% when they're left, compared to where there's a clear cut. So this idea of kin recognition it should transform how we reforest forests, that we should be leaving these old trees behind to provide the seed and to nurture their young, that those seedlings will be locally adapted. And it turns out that the fungi themselves have co-evolved with those locally adapted seeds. And so you just end up with a much more resilient forest community when you pay attention to things like kin recognition in plants. And I'm just going to comment one more thing, Vicki, that you brought up, which is, these old forests are also, when they're healthy and intact, where you have old trees left behind, they store a ton of carbon, and carbon is the currency of the day, because we're in a climate crisis and we need to be protecting carbon stocks in forests, in soils. And right now we're not doing that. Yeah, and leaving these old trees behind is a key way to do that, and leaving old growth forests, not chopping them down, leaving them for the carbon stocks and biodiversity that they provide, and then restoring, the forests that we have damaged, so they have those capacities again.
And don't these trees help other trees in times of distress and sickness?
They do. That's another incredible discovery, is that, trees that are dying, let's say you're an old tree and you're dying, or even a young tree and you're dying, you have, or you're being damaged by some kind of pathogen or infestation. If it's a sudden infection, the trees will upregulate their whole defense machinery to deal with that. So that it activates what's called the jasmonic acid pathway, which produces a bunch of byproducts that stimulate the tree to start producing a whole bunch of chemicals. A number of those chemicals end up passing through mycorrhizal networks to neighboring trees and plants, even of different species. Those plants take that information and they say, okay, there's a threat. It's almost like they're eavesdropping on the parents, saying, oh, there's a threat. And so then they upregulate their own defense genes and start to increase their defense as well. So yes, the other thing that happens is that these old trees as they're dying or getting sick, they don't just send messages, they send energy. So what we found is about 40% of the energy photosynthate in a dying tree is dispersed through its mycorrhizal network directly into certain neighboring plants. So it's not like, you know, when these trees die, that they're just dispersing their, you know, energy to the ethos, you know, at random. It's actually very directed, and it is directed through their networks to those particular offspring or plants that are the healers of the next generation.
And they talk, and they send messages about who is friend and who is foe and how to adapt and survive. Do they
Yes.
not?
Yes, they do.
Right.
Yes. So,
How
so
do
yeah.
they, I mean, it's amazing. They send messages about, talk about that.
Well, so they, you know, plants, trees are incredibly perceptive and discerning. They're also very responsive to messages. So they, you know, imagine yourself a tree and you've got your neighborhood around you, and there's different species and plants. A tree perceives all of those neighbors. They know who is who. You know, they've lived beside them for, in many cases, thousands of years. They know these neighbors intimately. They know the species, they know the relatedness, they know if they're in the shade, they know if they're in the sun, they know if they need nitrogen or water. And so this perception then governs how they interact with their neighbors. It shapes their relationships. And so, you know, and part of that messaging is about protection, about of the whole community. And that is important too. That's an important concept, that these communities, these societies are organized in ways that make the whole society healthy, right? So the diversity of that community really matters, right? So if you have an extreme event, for example, and you have a diversity of species that's been fostered by this community, by the perception of neighbors, by the sharing of resources, by the uplifting of the regeneration, by creating and fostering and nurturing that diversity, the forest itself increases its resilience and resistance to damage. So for example, let's say you have a forest that's got 10 species in it of trees, and some are short, some are tall, some live a long time, some shorter. They all have different niches. Let's say a big windstorm comes through. Well, that windstorm is going to take out, you know, probably the tall ones with the big sail, but those understory trees are going to survive it. And then they become, what they do is they take over where that gap has been exposed by the big tall tree blowing over. They take over and they expand their leaf area and they take over those functions. And so you still have a forest standing. And that is why, you know, these trees know this, the community knows it. And so they actually, you know, all of these processes I'm talking about feed into that maintenance of biodiversity so that they are resistant and resilient to these events that happen.
Well, you know, we started this conversation talking about the fires around you, but what are fires? I mean, you know, one generally knows about fires in forests, but what do fires, are they good for forests, and how do we need to manage? I mean, do we do managed fires, which I know we do, but, and what do the fires, more to the point, do to the mycorrhizal fungi?
Yeah, excellent question. So fire is part of our natural disturbance regimes in forests across around the world. Some forests have got more frequent low intensity fires. Others have got infrequent high intensity fires, depending on the climatic area. There's also been like millennia of Aboriginal burning in our forests that has also been important in the shaping of our landscapes and our forests. And what we've been doing since colonialism is to suppress fires. And the idea being, well, we're going to save these forests for our own use. And suppress the fires so that, you know, that this forest, we can log it in the future. We'll put it in our plans in our spreadsheet and it'll be there and we'll go log it and then we can move on to the next forest. Well, it hasn't worked out that way because these forests need fire to keep healthy. So if you leave fire, if you emit fire from the landscape, from the natural disturbance regime, you start to build up fuels. Because these fires, so for example, a lot of fires are these understory fires, and they'll take out, seedlings that are coming up that actually can turn into ladder fuels that help the fire get into the crowns of old trees. And the Aboriginal people would burn these forests every so often to clean out the understory and to make space for plants. And so these suppressed it and actually outlawed Aboriginal burning. We actually outlawed it. The fuel buildup in those forests has gone up and up and up. And then we have climate change at the same time.
Why was it outlawed? Why was it outlawed?
Because the land was basically taken away from the Aboriginal people and managed by colonists. At least that's the case in Canada. And the management of all the resources was, that obligation, that responsibility that the Aboriginal people had for looking after it, that was all taken away. And we said, oh, we're going to do this now. But little did colonialism know is that those practices honed over thousands of years helped those forests stay healthy. And now we have this sort of very explosive situation where we've got climate change, we have highly buildup of fuels in our forests, and we also have plantations that are highly flammable. That's created a greatly vulnerable landscape. So we really need to restore this. And how do you do that? You can go in and reinstate Aboriginal burning. That's what we're doing in Canada, and do prescribed burning. And I mean, I say we're doing this in Canada, but we're just starting to think about it. But it's definitely.
Yeah, but Suzanne, I was going to ask you this because you're really talking about how, you said this a few times, that forestry has not changed. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about what your vision of forestry going forward is and how we need to have variety, landscape, and a natural occurrence between trees.
Yeah, when I say forestry hasn't changed, it has changed, but it hasn't necessarily changed for the better. It goes through these waves. It depends on the, who's in charge, what the administration is at the time, right? Who the politicians are. They have a great deal to say about the laws and policies and regulations that flow from the laws. So we have actually, slid backwards, I would say, at least in Canada over the last 20 years, where we were starting to do more ecosystem-based management, and then it just became an exploitation, and the clear cutting expanded, like a cancer across the land. And now we're reaping the benefits, or the effects of that with floods and fires and so on. What do I see as a vision moving forward? Well, one thing we need to do is we need to wrest away from these major corporations the responsibility for looking after our forests. We shouldn't be giving that over to them because they don't know what they're doing. They're there to make money. They're not there to look after the land and the air and the water. And if we continue to let them take charge of our forests, then we need to be, making sure that there's money for them to manage the land. But I still say, no, it's the individual people who care about their trees and forests that are going to do the best jobs. So that's the number one thing is the, who owns these forests and who's going to look after them. And then the second thing is, in this era of climate crisis and biodiversity loss, we need to save our old growth forests. Stop cutting them down, just stop already. And it's still going on to this very day. Like, even as I speak, trees are falling in my backyard. Not my backyard, out the window. So we've got to put a stop to that. It's a tragedy to do that in this period when we know so much. And then, the third thing we need to do is when we have these damaged forests, and they are damaged, where forest floors have shrunk from 1 meter thick to 5 centimeters thick, we need to restore those carbon stocks, restore that biodiversity. And that means, doing good ecosystem-based management, which has a whole bunch of things in it, but one of them is letting these trees grow to great ages. And then, planting trees, right? So we have lost about a third of our forests worldwide. We need to recover those, and that means planting forests where they have been gone, because they are great sequesters of carbon. They're the most ingenious, highly evolved tools that we have to draw down CO2 from our polluted atmosphere. I could go on and on, but those are some basic principles.
I have a few questions before I have to turn it over to Malvika, but Subaru is replanting 1 million trees in forests devastated by wildfire in partnership with the National Forest Foundation. What do you think of that program?
I think that's
Are you
really
aware
great.
of it?
I am aware of it. I see it on TV. That's about all I know about it. But so why is this so important right now? Well, forests recover on their own. They can recover without us, right? But we've gotten to this tipping point where we can't step back and just let it take its course, because we don't have time for that. We have pushed our ecosystems to the point of collapse. So we've got to go in there and be the physicians to bring it back to help bring it back to life. And so that means going in and planting and making sure, when Subaru puts money in, that part of it is also research into understand what species belong there, which ones are going to help the forest recover the best. There's no point in putting in a species or genotype that's just going to die in a year. And believe me, we've made those mistakes over and over and over again in history. So we really need to be smart about it, invest in research, invest in local forest management to make sure these forests are good, but we do need that. We need that funding. We need those trees. And the longer we wait to, the harder it gets to get the forest back, because as the fires have gone through, they're very severe fires, and they've burned down through the forest floor and killed a lot of the mycorrhizas. And so we've got to get the seedlings back in there right away, pumping energy back into the soil to re-enliven that mycorrhizal network, and so that they recover faster, and with those species and genotypes that are best adapted to those local conditions.
A question that I wanted to ask you, which you could probably spend 2 hours, if not more, answering, and I don't know if we have time for you to go into a whole long thing, is really, what have you learned from the Aboriginal people, the indigenous people of North America? And let me just say, before you gear up and answer that question, the other question, I think it's important, there are 2 other things. One is to talk about the Mother Tree Project and what you hope it will accomplish. And the last is, what are if there are any, on your website, best reforestation programs that people can be part of, that they can go to your website and contribute or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll answer the last question first, is that I have a website called mothertreeproject.org, and you can go to that, and there you can actually make a donation to the Mother Tree Project if you want. There are other really important organizations that are at the forefront of reforestation and looking after old growth forests. So for example, there's something called One Earth. One Earth is a philanthropic hub where there's a whole bunch of projects that you can sort of shop and donate money to, and some of them include reforestation, some include saving old growth forests. There's all kinds of, some are in riparian, some are in ocean environments, but it's a really good hub to figure out where to go. So it's called One Earth. There are other organizations.
The good news is that there are a lot of activities and a lot of organizations that are trying to do something.
There are.
What do you think of the best reforestation programs?
What are the best ones?
Do you think that there are any that are superior, or do you think that they're all doing good work?
I think we have to be really judicious about this. There's probably going to be pop-up companies that don't know what they're doing. So you really need to make sure that it's well vetted. You know, like the big environmental non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace or Stand Earth or Canopy Planet, these are international organizations. Those are all very solid. They know what they're doing. So I would do my research first. They'll be science ecosystem based, you know, that's what they'll be promoting. A lot of these big angos are now working with Aboriginal people because, you know, when you look at biodiversity and carbon stocks in the world, they map directly on where Aboriginal people have jurisdiction over their own territories. And so there's a recognition that is a key. It's an easy recognition to make. Hey, you know, it worked there, so let's figure out what they're doing right. And so a lot of the angos are working with the native people to reinvigorate their forests and just like give them the tools so that, and some money like conservation financing, so that, because a lot of these Aboriginal nations, they end up getting in debt because they're impoverished, and then the way they get out of debt is they take loans, and then those loans sometimes are corrupted, and then they have to go log their forests in order to pay off their debts. And so a lot of the big angos are saying, hey, we're going to try to relieve that debt so that you can look after your forests. That I think is going to be a global phenomenon going forward.
Well, look, I think you're going to, I don't know if you're going to read now or there are going to be some questions, but I just want to say this. The scientific conclusions are impossible to ignore, that the forest is wired for wisdom and healing and sentience, and we have much to learn from them. And your book, Finding the Mother Tree, is a deeply personal and affecting story of family, of love, of life and death, of revelation. And it's a galvanizing book of inspiration, urging us to see our physical world in a whole new way. And I thank you for writing it. And I want to thank the Brooklyn Rail again for bringing this event to be. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you, Suzanne. This conversation has been phenomenal. We've had a number of questions pour in the chat. Hopefully we should be able to get to all of them. First up, we have Julie Rice. Julie, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hi, Suzanne, it's a complete honor to be able to address you. I have your book. I've really enjoyed it. I've watched your TED Talk, amazing. But I guess if you could just clarify, is it really that across the board, this amazing research about how trees behave with each other has not changed anything about industrial logging? I mean, you'd think that people would be looking out for their own best interests and see that forests will last longer if they are handled in a different way. Do you see no evidence that this research has made a difference?
You know, it's made a huge difference in the psyche of people. And it's with people that change starts in the environmental movement. And so I would say, you know, from my landscape that I live in British Columbia and across Canada, where the industry is still, you know, in control of the big major licensees, that there has been no change in forestry practices, if not gotten worse. But this is about to change. You know, how systems work, as we started out at the beginning, is that at a point of crisis, there's a moment, there's a tipping point where change is possible. And the status quo is going to try to reestablish the pillars of what they were as quickly as possible to maintain that status quo. But this is also the time when change makers come in with their research, their ideas, their strength, and say, no, we're not going to keep doing it this way. We're going to change. And we're at this moment right now, right? We're very much in that moment precisely right now. And so even though change has not happened, I think it's about to change in a big way. And I encourage everybody, you know, to be part of that change. I mean, we all need to be part of it. Our lives depend on it, to be honest.
Thank you. That's encouraging.
Thanks. That was a great question.
Thank you so much, Julie, for kicking off the Q&A. Next, I'll pass the mic to Aviva Ramani. Aviva, you should be able to turn on your microphone.
Thank you. Suzanne, I've followed you and admired your work for a long time. I reference you in my own book that's coming out next year. And when you referred to corporations as corpse, I thought, oh, the corpses, the dead are taking the living, they're necrotizing it. But I have a question for you specifically about what happens with deciduous trees in the winter when the leaves are down. Can you describe what the ecosystem is doing at that time, specifically for deciduous trees?
Yeah, it depends on where you are. But deciduous trees occur all the way up to the Arctic Circle and all the way down, to the equator and beyond down to South America. So they're everywhere, and they're so the climatic is hugely variable. But even in a wintry area like up in the boreal forest near where I live, those deciduous trees are still active in the winter. So even though they've lost their leaves and they're dormant, the tree itself is dormant, but the whole microbiome is not completely dormant. It slows down because temperatures go down. But we know that, for example, even under the snow, that there's some respiration going on, and that's the soil food web that's doing that. And so they're basically cycling. They're doing some cycling of the nutrients and carbon under the frozen, the snowpack, or under the frozen soil. And then the rest of the year, when the leaves are leafed out, deciduous trees are extremely important in forests because they have high photosynthetic rates. I mean, that's one reason, and they're full of nitrogen. So they're very, very physiologically active. They sequester huge amounts of carbon. In Canada, when we compare, for example, recovery of forests from a carbon budget point of view, it's the aspens and poplars and birches that recover the fastest. And it's because of these high photosynthetic rates. So a conifer forest, whereas it will take maybe 40 years to recover to carbon neutrality after a disturbance, a deciduous forest will only take 20 years, half the time. And it's because of that great activity. It's the way they're built, right? They're built to be physiologically extremely active. And then, of course, they also are full of water and different compounds than coniferous trees. So the water part is really important, especially in fire-prone landscapes. So if you have deciduous trees mixed with conifers, for example, or just deciduous trees, they're much less flammable than a coniferous plantation. And so, ironically, since Rachel Carson wrote her book and beyond, when herbicides and pesticides have become one of the dominant tools in forests, one of the things they target are these deciduous trees because they're not considered to be lucrative. And in so doing, by getting rid of them, we've actually, really endangered our ecosystems because we've lost that, that resilience and also the ability to resist fire because we've taken these broadleaves out of the landscape, which are honestly like asbestos if we left them in there. So anyway, I could go on, but those are some of the key things.
Thank you for a wonderful response.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aviva. Moving right along, I'll pass the mic to our friend G.E. Schwartz.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I love so much about your book and why I find it so important was it's not just about trees, it's about us. But
yes.
And so that's why all your metaphors and everything are amazing, and your writing, which brings that out. Can you tell us about endosymbiosis and what it is both scientifically and metaphorically, and why it's so essential?
Yeah, so of the mycorrhizas, the fungi, there's big groups of them. We call them functional groups. So there are ectomycorrhizas, which grow on the outside of the roots, and then there's endomycorrhizas that grow on the inside of the root cortical cells. And the most common group are called arbuscular mycorrhizas, arbuscule like a tree, that they actually infect the inside, the cortical cell of the plant or the tree, and form a little tree itself, with a very high surface area where you have this carbon nutrient exchange, where the photosynthate is provided by the plant cell and then the nutrients by the fungus. And these endomycorrhizas are, they're the most common kind in the world. there's actually, 5 functional groups of them. There's the arbuscular, there's another kind called ericoid, which are only on heather plants and salals and huckleberries. There's arbutoid, which only associate with arbutus trees and arctostaphylos. There's orchid mycorrhizas, or another endomycorrhiza, which only form on orchids. And so they're the most common kind. Most of the plant families, except for the Pinaceae, for example, forms ecto, but most of them form endos, and so they're the most ubiquitous around the world. The tropical trees are almost all endomycorrhizal, whereas our temperate and boreal forests are almost all ectomycorrhizal. And there's only about 200 species of these endomycorrhizas worldwide, which means that because there's low species diversity, that the possibility for connection between species is extremely high. They're generalist fungi, they're not specific to certain trees and plants. They're very general. So they're great connectors, and they're the most common type. I could go on, but that gives you in a nutshell.
Oh, no, that's fine. Thank you so
Okay.
much. Again, more examples about us and for us. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. And the people part of the forest is really important. And I think that, that's one thing, sorry, I'm going to go on about this a little bit, is that the separation of people from nature is what's led in large part to our exploitation of nature. And we can be positive forces in forests. We've been negative, but we also have a long thousands of years of history of being positive agents in forests. And it's really only the last 100 years that we've kind of strayed away from that. So we need to get back to our roots, so-called our roots, get back to, our role as kin of trees, to look after them, carry out our responsibilities, not abrogate them. We have a responsibility to look after these forests.
Thank you so much, Suzanne and GE. What a beautiful question, and what a beautiful line, our role as kin of trees. Next up, I'll pass the mic to Halia in the audience. Halia, take it away.
Hi.
Hi.
This is my first time meeting and learning about your work. I haven't read your book, I confess.
That's okay.
And my question is probably a really basic one that's covered in all of your writings. But is the term mother tree chosen because of an Aboriginal term, or is there a father tree or parent trees? I just wondered how that term came to be.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent
question.
No, it's an excellent question. So the idea of mother trees, grandmother trees, grandfather trees, father trees have been in cultures forever, right? Trees have been central in people's lives all around the world ever since there have been people. And so it's not really my term. I can't say that it's my term, but as scientists, we never use that term. We recognize, like, most tree species have the mothers and fathers in the same tree. But the reason that I started using that term was more as a metaphor for the regenerative capacity that these old trees provide for the forest. And it was actually a term that I thought of with my students and a filmmaker who were trying to translate this science into easy to understand ways, and so that's what emerged out of it. But definitely, a better term might be elder tree. But mother tree also conjures up an understanding almost right away that, oh, they're regenerative, they're nurturing the next generations. So that's how that came about. But it's not a scientific term, it's a metaphorical term.
Thank you so much for that question, Halia. And I want to emphasize as well, we got a couple other people in the chat came in with the same question about the name. One among them was the wonderful Frank Maresca, who unfortunately had to leave, but sent in a wonderful bevy of so many questions. I'm going to ask two on his behalf. The first is, are we in some ways moving forward with a positive change? If not, what can we do to help? And the second question is, Suzanne, what do you think about people who hug trees?
So the first one is about positive change. You know what, we all play a role in this, whether it's being, you know, a scientist or an activist or a forest defender or a consumer, or just a voter, or even just raising your families, this wisdom needs to be, you know, held in our hearts and guide us, because it's knowledge, it's a knowledge of how these systems work, and to use it to the best of our ability to restore our forests to these productive, healthy places. Again, we all benefit from that. You can, you know, even if you have limited capacity, you can write to your, well, we call them MLA, members of parliament, I guess in your case to Congress or your senators, to your leaders, your political leaders. Donate to organizations that are on the front lines, support forest defenders, donate to, you know, organizations that are there to preserve old growth forests, right? Conservation financing is going to be hugely important as we go forward. So in order, you know, there's a program called the REDD Plus program, where wealthy countries provide funding to poorer countries to basically save their forests. That's a good program. There's going to be other programs coming on board as well. Pushing your politicians to put a price on carbon. You know, that's something you can do too, right? Once we have a price on carbon, it changes the whole scene, right? It changes everything. Suddenly, you know, suddenly the forest is more valuable standing up than laying down and being cut up. So all of those things are things that you can do, right? And spread the word. And is it okay to hug a tree? Of course. It's good for you and it's good for the tree. I do it all the time.
That's Frank being Frank.
There were such sweet questions, we had to include them, and I've dropped a link in the chat to REDD. We encourage everyone to check it out. For our final question, it's my privilege to pass the mic to our very own publisher and artistic director, Phong H. Bui. Phong, take it away.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Vicky, as I call her now, for this wonderful conversation. And I began reading the book, and I expect to get through it during the winter break with pleasure. But a quick question, Suzanne. We have our Rail Kyoto project, and the last project we did was in Venice, and the subject was predicated on the sinking city of Venice. We have this ongoing annual publication dedicated to global warming and climate change. It's called the River Rail. We just launched the River Rail Puerto Rico on its recovery from Maria. So the one in Venice, we were there for 6 months long. During that lengthy duration, there were many different panels organized, being the purpose was to bring scientists together with philosophers and artists to talk about what potentially can be collaborated on. And immediately it occurred to us that most scientists are not great talkers about what they do, because due to the nature of their being hermetic and insular and spending time without daily communication and whatnot. So my question is that, is there ways to bring them out? And is there a way, I mean, of course, having someone like yourself write so well and communicate so well, which is super useful, but in the normal senses, in academic setting, and it prevents them to have a platform in which they can communicate clearly. What do you think about that, Suzanne? I mean, is that true in your own experience among your colleagues, scientist colleagues?
Yeah, you know, it's a really good question. My phone's ringing, sorry. So I've, you know, scientists have a privileged position of being protected to do their research. They get tenure, so that when they have opinions that they're not fired or ostracized. Maybe they're ostracized but not fired, so that they have that intellectual freedom. But there's still a great deal of fear, I would say, among academics of stepping out of their comfort zone and talking, of being activists, if you want to go that far. And there's a great deal of self-regulation in academic communities not to do that, right? Like, it's almost like if you cross that line, you've been tainted and you're no longer an objective scientist. So there's a great deal of self-regulation going on in these scientific communities, which I think is unfortunate. And really, I think that when people have something valuable to say that will help society, they need to say it. And I think that also as academics to support each other in doing that, you know, because it is not easy to step out and be criticized. And so I think that, but the whole institutions are set up in order to, you know, it doesn't foster that kind of communication. You can, you know, you don't get credit for being on the radio, you get credit for publishing more papers and getting more grants. And so that's what people do. And so, and in fact, deans can actually go after you if you go out in public and start saying, you know, things, and, you know, you can get, you know, really pressed down. I think that needs to be changed. I think that that we need to open up academia so it's more inclusive, more inclusive, more diverse, and that there's a you know, an opportunity to speak out about what you know. And you know, for example, I'm going to give one real example from my faculty right now, is that we've had these incredible floods, you know, in the last little while. It's probably been in the news even on the East Coast, and where whole towns have been flooded. And one of the main reasons for this flooding is because of logging. But the news media was saying, well, it's because of the fires, it's the atmospheric river, it's climate change, it's out of our hands. No, it's not out of our hands. You know, we are responsible for what happened by clear cutting 90% of the valleys around these little towns. And so finally, you know, the hydrologist came out and said that based on his research. And I thought that was great, but he was hesitant to do it. And I know it's because of that self-regulation that goes on in academia. So I think that, you know, I think that encouraging scientists and academics to speak out. And then of course, there's the trust part, which I know that there's like this movement to not trusting science. But I think that when people tell their stories of where it came from, and, you know, that it's not just that they come from a place of heart and wisdom and many years of science in a, you know, to, you know, the antecedent things that fostered that science. When people understand where it comes from, they'll trust it more. And and I think that scientists out there telling their stories will help do that instead of hiding away in the hallowed halls of academia.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I'm right now also am reading Stanley Fish's book, Saving the World on Your Own Time, a kind of critique of academic practice in which you can't really, doesn't allow you to voice your political social view in your classroom. You can do that outside of it, which is super true in academic standard or regulation, whatnot. But the idea is that we need to foster that kind of relationship, because there's not many of them are like Noam Chomsky at the moment, who's still out there doing on the behalf. We are, you know, facing the lack of public intellectuals, Suzanne.
Yeah.
You know, we once had them talking clear language to middle and working class Americans. Everyone knew that, but there's all of a sudden we lack that support in the middle who can voice their opinion, criticize both on the left and the right. And so I don't know what ways we are trying to do, but for example, this issue, we are welcoming our friend W.J.T. Mitchell, one of the great minds who helped create Critical Inquiry, where he has been the editor for at least 40-something years. And Tom, as we call him, admitted that they've been really insulated by the academic intellectual freedom, and they began writing to each other in academic languages. and really losing the voice, the national
Mhm.
politics platform that they once had. So if it applied to what we are doing, what you are doing, I think it's similar fostering or at least encouragement must be applied, must be working out from that tiny little orbit.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So
You're
just
welcome. Yeah. Thank you. That I think you're absolutely right. You know, when we have that, when we lose that academic and scientific discourse in the public arena, then people, well, the level of education goes down and then the distrust builds. So yeah, I think academics need to get back out there and be supported by their governments to do that.
Yeah, it's just a frightful prospects. And anyway, Vicky and I have plans. We're gonna do something radical, right, Vicky? Well, thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Suzanne. Back to you, Malvika.
Thank you, Fong. It's a pleasure. Loved your question.
Thank you so much, Fung, for your question. And thank you, Suzanne and Vicky. And I want to give a special shout out to Kathy Zadoreski in the chat for your beautiful question. We'll be sure to connect you after the program so you can get your answer at length. But now it's time to turn to poetry. So at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a reading of some kind. Today, I'm so excited to pass the mic back to Suzanne, who will read a passage from her book. Suzanne, what did you end up selecting for us?
Yeah, I'm just going to read a short little thing. Okay, so this is from the second chapter called Hand Fallers. And it harkens back to my dad, who of course was very important to me. So here we go. So I have a tradition of trusting that nature is resilient, that the earth will rebound and come to my rescue even when nature turns violent. But Dad's mother was so keenly aware of the peril in bushwork that it gave her pause. She had been crippled in her 20s with drop foot from an infection and wanted the lives of her sons to be freer and safer. Even so, Uncle Jack stayed a logger and worried about his mom to the point of living at home until he was 40. But Dad left the bush while young. The incident that triggered his decision, he described it for us that day of the treasure hunt, the sun lowering as we sat on logs, my brother and sister and I, the metal chokers we'd happily unearthed piled nearby. And it came when he was only 13 and my Uncle Jack was 15. They'd quit high school to help Grandpa Henry and Uncle Wilfred. Their job was to wait on floating logs lashed together with a rawhide into a boom on Maple Lake as each piece of bucked cedar banged the walls of the flume, snaking a kilometer down Simard Mountain and thundered toward them like a luge. Once the log hit the water, it was up to Dad and Uncle Jack to steer it into the boom. While shivering one morning in the spring rains, Dad panicked. Wooden pike pole in hand, iron lance spliced to its end, he tried to stay balanced on the log rolling below him. "It's coming," Jack shouted, his feet barely keeping pace with his own churning log, while Dad's gathered momentum as waves lapped. The cedar log launched from the bottom of the flume, like a skier off an Olympic jump, arching higher than usual before piercing the water 20 meters in front of them, straight into the bottomless lake. There was no telling where it would explode back like a missile to the surface. Time stopped. Dad told us his mind had snapped back to the essay he'd written about World War II before he quit high school, when he wrote, "All night long, the cannons went boom, boom, boom." His teacher had asked for 500 words, but Dad had no idea how to string so many words together to describe a soldier's terror. He was sure the log would shoot up and pulverize him. "Run, Pete," Jack yelled. But he couldn't, not even when Jack ran towards the shore, screaming at Dad to follow him, to get the hell out of any chance of the log's path. Dad couldn't hear a thing. Seconds ticked by. Boom! The log shot sky high 20 meters behind him before landing with a swoosh. tremors through Dad's hands as he trained the bobbing log into the boom. In the fall, Grandpa's boat Putt-Putt would tug the boom downriver to sell the largest logs to sawmills, with smaller diameter cedars going to Bell Pole Company for telephone poles. Dad went into grocery store management not long afterwards and stayed there his entire life. But the forest would always be in our lives' blood. Thank you. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I love that.
Very
boom,
nice,
boom,
Suzanne.
boom.
Thank you.
Well, I don't want us to leave. This has been such a treat. But thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you, Victoria. Special thanks, of course, goes to Mark Jaffe, Stephanie Troughton, and Bobby Joe behind the scenes at Knopf, and the University of British Columbia for all of your help truly in putting this event together. Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest is out now, and you can find a link to get your copy below. I'll drop it in the chat. And to everyone, we encourage you to check out the recordings of our programs on our events archive. The recording of today's conversation will be available in just a day or two, should you want to revisit this magical space. I know I will. And we do this every day at the Rail, so please join us again tomorrow when we're joined by New Orleans multimedia artist Dawn Dodo, in conversation with Rail editor-at-large Dan Cameron and artist and arts administrator Joseph S. Lewis III, for a conversation on the exhibition Dawn Dodo, The Space Between Worlds at the New Orleans Museum of Art through January of next year. We'll close that out with a poetry reading by Cliff Feynman, and that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern right here in the Zoom. Other than that, thank you all so much. This has been such a pleasure, and I'll invite you to turn on your microphones to say hello to each other, goodbye on your way out, or anything that compels you. But thank you, Suzanne. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, and thank you, Victoria.
Yeah.
Thank you, Malka.
Thank you. It's been great. And thanks again, Malvika.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Suzanne,
everyone,
for your
for your
work.
questions.
Thank you, Suzanne.
I want to
Thank
show
you,
my
Victoria.
book.
Show the book.
I dig it around so much. It's all there.
That's awesome.
That's what we like to see.
Thank you.
I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Congratulations, book. Bye. Bye, G. Hey, David.
Hey,
Tom.
Tom.
Hello.
Good
How
fun.
you doing? Hey.
Hi, Tom.
I'll call
Hi,
you
G.
later. Okay? Much love. Much
Much
love.
love.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, David.
And courage.
Hello,
Bye, you
hello. Keep it up. I'll see you guys tomorrow for dawn.
Yes, David. I'm
See you
gonna bring.
again.
Ciao.
Take care.